Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Girimbazi. I am a research fellow at the Center of Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resource Management at the University of Rwanda. I am also in charge of organizing research seminars or seminar series. So today I'm happy to introduce you to our speaker, Cathy Watson, Chief of Partnerships for the Center for International Forestry Research and World Agroforestry. She holds a graduate degree in biology from Princeton University and also a graduate certificate in agroforestry from the University of Missouri, USA. She is interested in agroforestry and has previously led some youth NGOs in Uganda, dealing with issues including tree restoration. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Cathy Watson.
Yes, hello everybody, good afternoon. This is really a pleasure. So I'm going to be presenting on trees on road verges and city trees. And I'm going to argue that they can be repositories of biodiversity and can boost human well-being and also protect the grey infrastructure of the road. So thank you very much, and I'll start now. So thanks for having me. And this is me. I have an undergraduate degree in biology from Princeton. I studied agroforestry at the University of Missouri, and I've been building partnerships for World Agroforestry and then for CIFOR more recently. And I've been a journalist and an NGO leader in East Africa for the last 30 years. I'm also an Ashoka Fellow, and I am an advocate for youth and biodiversity. So I want to start with a question, which is, you see this bare land on this highway in Kenya. What if this could become a home to tree species like the ones you see on your right, Xanthoxylum usambarensis and Rothmania uccelliformis? I believe you have both of those species in Rwanda. They're very rarely planted, and they're very important for biodiversity and ecosystems. So tree biodiversity is vital, and we need space for it, but it's a non-trivial challenge, especially in countries like Rwanda, which have quite high population density. It's a challenge to integrate trees onto farms. There's farmer preferences. They may just want fruit trees. And then there are space constraints as well. But what if we took advantage of the edges of roads, of roadsides? And I've looked at the data from the African Development Bank, and Rwanda has a feeder road network of almost over 2,500 kilometers. And they have a paved network of road of about 2,000 kilometers. So that's really a lot of road. And I'd like to suggest that you might think about this, that Rwanda might be able to plant up to 1 million trees of very high biodiversity value, which have a good chance of being permanent on the landscape, not being cut, if they use their roadsides. How many trees could be planted would depend on the size of the tree when it becomes mature, how deep the road edge is, and the spacing that you plant them between trees. And this is a manual that my organization has been involved in. And there's a lot out there if you go online and you Google roadside tree planting. But one report said that trees should be planted 12 meters apart along the road and at least 5 to 6 meters away from the edge of the road, so they have enough space to spread and not interfere with the traffic. Well, in the bypass project that I've been working on in Nairobi, we actually planted the trees 5 meters apart. So you can see that you could get more trees than if you planted them closer together. So I think you probably know about the IUCN and Government of Rwanda Rwanda Forest Landscape Restoration Opportunity Assessment in 2014. It identified areas for interventions with trees, agroforestry, woodlots, industrial plantations, natural forest restoration, and protective forest creation. But the opportunity presented by roadside planting is not mentioned, nor is the opportunity of trees in cities. And I think this is a missed opportunity. We've got space for more trees in those areas. And at a spacing of 5 meters, which is what we used for the Kenya bypass, or at 12 meters spacing, with a road system, what Rwanda has, of about 500 kilometers, this could mean an additional 400,000 to 1 million trees for Rwanda. And if the species for the roads were selected for their biodiversity attributes, this could make a major contribution to preserving valued species that in turn support other biodiversity like birds and bats. And this is some planting of the vule tree in eastern Uganda about 100 years ago. You can still see these magnificent trees, and their seeds are dispersed by bats, and there they are. And we could do this sort of thing in roads in all over East Africa. So farmland is a place that harbors very important tree biodiversity, but roadside planting could be of particular benefit in Rwanda, where a baseline by my organization, ICRAF, found that exotic trees are much more common on farms in Rwanda than in other African countries. We compared it with 7 other African countries. Across these 8 countries, households tended to have more indigenous tree species on farm, 2.9 species on average, compared with exotic species. They had a little bit less than 2 different exotic species on farm on average. The exception was in Rwanda, where the average number of indigenous tree species is only 0.44 against 2.2 for exotic species. So already, Rwanda is a little bit challenged that exotic species predominate on your farmland, which is, after all, the majority of the land in the country. So city trees, I've made the point that roadside trees, running from Butare to Kigali, that road, for example, are important, but city trees are also hugely important and equally neglected and also a missed opportunity. So if we're talking about city trees now, the World Health Organization says few, if any, other public health interventions can deliver the positive health and social outcomes that green space in cities can, including heightened immune function and less respiratory disease. So that's WHO saying that city trees are really important for health. And then cities are warmer than surrounding areas and concentrate poorly fed people. So they're also ideal incubators for pathogens and disease vectors, but they mitigate this when they have trees which cool air and filter pollutants and capture carbon and shelter biodiversity at the same time. So that's another disease aspect where trees really help. And finally, FAO, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, says trees make cities more livable by reducing the impact of extreme weather, blocking harmful UV rays from the sun, and absorbing, refracting, and dissipating noise. And crime can even go down in a city that has trees compared to a city that doesn't have very many trees. And a study in Baltimore, which is an American city, which has a lot of deprivation in its downtown areas, in its center, a study there found a 10% increase in tree canopy was linked to a 12% decrease in crime. So trees can even do that for you in a city. So I think there's a point of inflection in a positive way with many African cities turning to trees. And you may have heard of Mayor Aki Sayer in Freetown, Sierra Leone. And she wants to turn Freetown into a tree town with 1 million trees to prevent floods and to improve well-being. And of course, landslides. And that's really the trigger, that photograph there of this forested landscape and where there's been a very serious landslide, which killed, unfortunately, took the lives of 1,000 people in 2017. So it's because people have moved closer and closer and up the mountain into the forest, and then the trees are no longer holding the hillside. But that was a trigger for the city wanting to address these problems. So Kampala Rwanda's neighbor, in Uganda, Rwanda's neighbor, has gone quite far on the whole city tree thinking, and they have an urban forestry management plan, and they've even conducted a census of 55,000 city trees. And they're also transitioning part of the downtown, as you can see in that picture, into a pedestrian-only zone where they're adding trees. So that's more good news from around the continent. And then in Nairobi, there's the famous Karura forest, which was saved by Nobel Prize winner Wangari Maathai against developers. Visitors to that forest, Karura, have doubled during COVID lockdown. And the city has restored a park in the downtown, which had become a dump site, a hideout, and a source of insecurity. They've made it free to visitors. And CIFOR-ICRAF, the Kenyan Forestry Research Institute, has planted indigenous trees there. So these are three very good examples. And I know there's tremendous progress in Kigali as well. It was already very, very green for several decades now. But I know there's now interest in developing a plan and in bringing more indigenous trees in. So these are very, very positive developments. But the problem is with all of these cities at the moment, unless we do something about it, is that biodiversity is very low. And we need to reverse that and invest in local flora. And let me just tell you about this tree census I referred to in Kampala. In 4 precincts of Kampala, there's like areas, they found a total of 328 tree species on the census, which looks really, really, really a good high diversity, and indeed it is. But then on closer examination, 80% of the species were exotic. And then when you looked at the individuals, the 53,000 individual trees that were surveyed, 37, almost 38,000, or 71% were exotic. And the most common tree was an avocado. So it looks good when you first look at the data, but then you find that actually indigenous trees are pretty few and far between. And a similar situation seems to pertain elsewhere in East Africa. In Addis Ababa, Shikur et al. Found 87% of seedlings planted along the main road were exotic, and that the density of exotic trees in the 3 public parks in the city was higher than indigenous trees by about 70%. And then similarly in 2012 in Kigali, although it may be changing, Seburanga and fellow researchers found that green space was largely dominated by alien species, 75%. And this picture here on the right is one of just 10 Entando Phragma angolense trees in Kampala. That's one of the largest trees in East Africa, but it all goes all the way down to Southern Africa and even across to West Africa. It's a magnificent tree. This one is on a street on Kololo, but most are actually at Makerere at the university. So this is a new rule that I've learned about, but it's the 10-20-30 rule. And it's a really good rule of thumb. And it addresses the importance of tree diversity in a city's street tree plan, because we can never predict when and if some new disease might pop up. So the best thing to do is prepare by having great diversity. And since insects and diseases generally affect certain tree species and their close relatives, having a diversity of trees will help to lessen the chances of major canopy loss. So the idea is that you have no more than 10% of any one species of tree in a city, no more than 20% of any one genus, and no more than 30% of any one family. And this reduces the risk of catastrophic loss to pests. And it's a theory and an idea that's been followed since the 1990s, and it was generated by the US Forest Service. So this is a backing up statement that supports the idea that we need to plant a diverse range of trees in our cities in East Africa. And my advice, but I think it's based on US Service Forest principles and other people's urban forestry principles, is when you have a space, select the largest tree possible for the space and go for broadleaf species. And that will help manage that means when you do that, you follow the principle of urban forestry, that managing the urban forest to maximize leaf surface can help to reduce storm water volume and thereby protect the road itself. And I just took these pictures off, that's off the internet, that one. That's the Entebbe bypass, but you can see they've just planted palm trees and I think a few eucalyptus, whereas in those spaces, you could actually have mavule trees, canarium, wafu, some of the really big, broad-leaved trees that you find along the Lake Victoria Crescent that are so important for biodiversity and would do so much to protect the road. And then the hand on the right, that's a Cordia africana, and you see how big the leaves can grow. And that's a ficus species as well, with also very big leaves. Very, very good for managing stormwater. So I'm now going to talk about the road I actually worked on, which is why I was invited to give this talk after giving that background to you. So what did we learn about, what do we learn from trying to regreen this 4-lane highway in Nairobi? And we started in December 2019, and we're still working on it. We learned that with climate crisis and biodiversity collapse, every space is an opportunity to capture carbon, create habitat, help groundwater infiltrate, and reduce the city floods and the urban heat island, which are such problems. So this is the highway before we started planting on it. Another thing we learned is that you need approval, and we got it from the Kenya Urban Roads Authority, who allowed my group and several other groups to start planting. They were interested in beautification and landscaping. We were sort of more interested in the concept of creating a green corridor, but really we were eye to eye, and we were very happy to be collaborating. But we did have some discussions about which tree species. Some were suggested to us, like Casuarina, which is an Australian evergreen, and Theveta peruviana, which is a Peruvian shrub, all parts of which are toxic. We were leaning much more towards planting indigenous trees. And we took off on that foot to plant indigenous trees. And one way we approached it was thinking about what natural vegetation was here before. And this area, until 100 years ago, was a tropical dry upland montane forest, and it receives about 1,700 millimeters of rain. It's at 1,700 meters in altitude and height, and its rainfall is a little less than 1,000 millimeters a year, and it comes in 2 seasons. So another learning is plant with the rains. Don't start when the rains are ending, which is how we started off here. We planted just as the rains were ending, and we lost quite a lot of what we planted. And also create employment for nearby communities. And we have done that, create green jobs. And these pictures were about 1.5 years ago when we started. Take time to prepare the land, remove rubble, mulch it, and reward the team as appropriate to your context. I know you've got Umuganda and Rwanda. That might be a good way to do this. In Kenya, that's not a tradition, and we hired people. And also work with a forester. And I think that won't be hard for you, but for some of the groups along the bypass, they didn't have a forester to turn to. And you can see the gentleman in blue. He's just retired he's a senior Kenyan forester who just retired from managing Kagura, and he had also done some urban planting, and we took a lot of advice from him. And there you can see him spacing out 5 meters along the bypass. And also plant diverse species. We planted 14 species on the 21st of January 2020. That was like our baptism day, where we really started getting the trees in the ground. And you can see the species here: Croton, Cordia, Teclea, Markhamia, Warburgia, Newtonia, Prunus africana, Spathidia nilotica, or campanulata, which is a Kenyan tree, Elgin olive, Vitex kenyensis, Albizia, Trichilia, Miletia dura, and Sapium ellipticum. And I know that in Rwanda, you will certainly have some of those species. And have a plan. My advice is have a plan, but deploy adaptive management. In other words, learn as you grow. as you go. And we added about 45 more tree species, and we planted the rarest ones out of the way of people or any kind of disturbance. We also relaxed a little bit. We wanted only to plant indigenous species, but we found it quite difficult to get an understory of indigenous species. So we added hibiscus, frangipani, canna lilies. One very nice thing, if you look at the picture in the center there, is we began to see wildlings. When we began to improve the soil, wildlings just popped up. That's Cordia africana right there, and we left them by and large. And the lower left-hand corner there is a wildflower, an African wildflower called Kleinia abyssinica. And we were able to get those. They're in the nurseries, and we planted as many of those as we could because we did want indigenous flowers as well as indigenous trees. And then in the bottom right there, you can see a ficus tree. We did plant ficuses, but we planted them really far from the road because we know they've got quite big roots, but we know they're also fantastic trees for biodiversity. And if possible, also plant grass and indigenous flowers and shrubs, like I said. People really, really appreciate the grass. We have people sitting on it. This is the first grass we planted. This was a year ago today, and we had not yet mowed. And of course, it became very smart when we mowed it. And our advice is also to document progress with photos taken from the same angle if you can, and geotag trees if you have resources and expertise. We have not geotagged our trees, but if you can do it, it's a great thing. There are many programs where you can take a picture of the tree and put the botanical name, the local name, and it goes onto a map, and then you can later click on it. The documenting progress with photos, taken from the same angle if possible. People really understand things when you show them a before and after picture. So this is the same place where I showed you the forester pacing out the 5 meters, right? It's really exciting to see that in 10 months, 6 months, you can go from no trees at all to something that looks as nice as this. And then the big tree here that you see with the seedlings we're about to plant out next to it, that's a Vitex kenyensis, and that was one of our high-performing species. That's only about 8 months old, and it already looks like a tree with a really nice long bole there. And you're going to see biodiversity move in when you plant trees. So anticipate this and document them. And as you can see, these are tree frogs, 3 different species of the Hyperoleus genus. And we were really delighted when we saw them because we know they're an indicator of a bioindicator of a good environment. And I think you should also expect and manage complex social issues. We have a pastoralist community or several pastoralist communities in Kenya. From the red blanket that the gentleman is wearing, you can see he's a Maasai. And when there is lack of rain, herders do bring their herds into the city or into the suburbs of the city where they can find grass. And in fact, there's a wetland adjacent to this path here, and that's where these cows were heading. But they also damaged our trees and ate some of our grass. And we talked to the young men who were managing the herds. They were very polite, and they said they understood, and they did move their cattle away. But had we not been there, it would have been an issue, and we did lose about 10 trees. And you know, one has to just expect these things are going to happen. People could also set up, for example, kiosks where you want to have your trees, and then you may not be able to do anything about that. But people understood, and people appreciated what we were doing. So steep slopes are really a big problem. We have some very steep slopes. We've tried all sorts of different things. So try and manage them. We did these little fences to stop the soil from running all the way down onto the sidewalks. We didn't find any easy solutions. We have tried to use grass seed balls of indigenous seed wrapped in charcoal, and they haven't started sprouting yet, but we've got high hopes. Those are indigenous grasses. In some countries, they lay down kind of a cloth, a geotextile, and you can plant through them. but it's made from coconut, very often coconut husk matting. But it's not available in Kenya, and probably we wouldn't have been able to afford it. So we're still managing this, but the grass is actually beginning to come down from the flat area at the top of the slope. And try, if you can, to get some experience in pruning. Arboriculturist training would be ideal. You all probably know Cordia africana. It grows very fast, wonderful, great big leaves, fantastic beef forage and mulch. It's also fodder, but it doesn't establish apical dominance very easily. It doesn't have one growing point and go straight up. So we've had to try and teach ourselves how to stop this tree from going sideways and to go a little more vertically. And, you know, utilize existing deep local knowledge and botanical knowledge. Museums of Kenya, which has the herbarium in Kenya, and many scientists has been a very good resource for us. And you can see Dr. Kunuthia there on the right. She's a pollinator biologist looking at actually some sunflowers we planted. But she said, I want to come and look and see if your trees are good for pollinators. And then the young man there on the left is Eli Koge, who's the restoration manager for Karura Forest. He has fantastic knowledge of indigenous trees. And then the lady there in the middle has been running the team that's been on the bypass. She runs a local nursery. And I'd like to encourage all of you to register for the first African Forum on Urban Forests. It's the 5th to the 9th of July, and you have until May 14th to submit a paper or a poster. So we'd like you to also think about doing that. And that's an important moment for Africa, that there's going to be an urban forests conference online. So thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be able to give this presentation. And we do have some questions, and I can read them out. Let me just take a few of them, yeah? There's a question from Adrienne Chitayat. She says, planting indigenous species, especially fruiting ones, is beneficial for wildlife, but it could increase human-wildlife conflict. How can this potentially negative impact be mitigated and also be discussed with authorities? That's a very, very good question, Adrienne, and we did think a lot about planting avocado trees, and other groups along the bypass did. In the end, we didn't plant them close to the road because we were worried there is a large monkey community, or some monkeys, and we thought they would probably be getting hit by cars. We were also worried about children climbing them, falling down. We were worried about fruit falling on the road. So we steered clear of that, but we did plant both the Indian and the African Guinensis Zizigium tree, which is a tall tree with a small plum berry-like purple fruit, which is very popular in Uganda. They call it jambula, they call it jamun here in Kenya. They also call it nzambarao in Swahili. We planted quite a few of those. But I think we can also think about, you know, I'm very happy with trees like Vitex and Cordia because they have fruit that are very delicious for birds and possibly even bats. So we're also interested not just in, you know, mammalian human-wildlife conflict is often also an issue, but it would be great to get more owls, more eagles, more turacos, more go-away birds, those ones. So that was a good question. And then there's another question also from Adrienne, but I'll just do it quickly, which is she's noticed that there are a lot of non-native species like eucalyptus and pine along roadsides, and would we replace them with indigenous trees? And I think probably one wouldn't have to go around taking down trees. I think if you could add in some indigenous trees or do a second line further away from the road possibly, or if you found roads that are just being built, that's a really good moment to get some indigenous trees in there. I had a question from Placide Nkusi, who said, what do I think about the availability and accessibility of indigenous species? This is a big issue, and you have to really hunt around to find a nice variety of indigenous trees. It's not too difficult to get about 14 or so species from Kenya Forest Service, but there are a lot of, and it's also in the nurseries on the side of the roads in Nairobi. But luckily there's a botanical garden in Limuru, which is in the highlands just outside of Nairobi, further up. And the gentleman who runs that has got a lot of unusual, like the xanthoxylums, like Policia fulva, which is not so easy to get, like the Rothmania I showed you a picture of. So I think because the herbarium, I understand, is with you there in Butare, I think you're in a very, very good position to start raising some of the more unusual indigenous species, and indeed planting them around the campus and around Butare itself. Then somebody asked, how did we prepare for this activity? How did we decide where to plant? And did we do some site suitability analysis in terms of biophysical conditions and or social conditions? And that's from Bernadette Arakiwe. We were very concerned about not causing accidents by blocking where two roads joined and blocking people's line of sight into oncoming traffic. That was a huge one for us. We were also very careful not to create dark corners where people could hide and maybe jump out and mug people, because you have to think about security. And you know, there's also women walking up and down this road. So we always wanted it to be well treed, but you should be able to see through the trees and people shouldn't get kind of lost in the trees, if you know what I'm saying. We were also concerned that nobody got hurt by a tree. So any tree that had spines or thorns, we planted well back from where any pedestrian could be passing. And I think the seedling survival rate has been extremely high, you know, well in the 90s. But that's because we go there, we manure, we weed, we prop them up if we see them falling over. When we saw the Maasai cattle coming, we actually put up a bit of protector around them, just made of, you know, sticks from the surrounding bush, right? Let me see what other questions there are. I hope I've really been able to communicate the importance of this to you all as I just look here. Yeah, we had a question from Kampala, in fact, from Perpetua Akite. She says, in Kampala, it's not too difficult to plant trees, but in the suburbs, residents don't want trees outside their massive wall fences. But she sees great potential for upcoming urban towns where the planning is just beginning. And I think that's a really, really good point. I've seen new, you know, refugee areas or new little towns coming up in northern Uganda. Such a perfect time to get some trees as the roads are laid out. And I think that's just a great idea. We're very interested in forming a group, an East African group, an All Africa group of people who are working on this kind of tree planting, tree growing. And then there's a few questions about how difficult it is to find indigenous understory plants. And I think I went over that, and that's why I talked about at the end, we opted for hibiscus you know, which is that flowering plant with a big red or pink or white flower. In the end, I was happy with it because our tree species were so unusual that I didn't want people thinking we were doing something very wild. So I was also very happy to have agapanthus lilies and canna lilies and hibiscuses, things that you see like in landscaped gardens. So it's a nice mixture of a little bit wild and unusual, but also it has a nice garden feel to it as well. So I think I've probably answered most of the questions there. Thank you so much for listening. And it's been a pleasure. And please sign up for the FAO Congress or FAO Urban Forestry, our first African urban forestry meeting, which is going to be in July. And my email is c.watson@cgiar.org. And you're welcome to get hold of me that way. And you can also just Google me. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, and I'm in LinkedIn as well. So Cathy Watson. So thank you very, very much. And it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Cathy. It was a fantastic presentation. We are happy to have heard from you, and we hope to keep in touch. Thank you very much, and thank you all.